All right, let's dive into something called New Criticism. Now, this was one of the most powerful and honestly one of the most controversial movements in literary theory. It was a complete revolution in reading that totally changed how we study literature in the 20th century. And to really get our heads around it, we have to start with one big question.
Think about it. When you pick up a book, do you need to know about the author's personal struggles, their love life, or the historical period they lived in? Or should that book, that piece of art, stand completely on its own? This is the core debate that New Criticism just throws right in our faces. And to help us navigate this really fascinating idea, we're drawing from some excellent course materials from the Department of English at Odisha State Open University. So a big thanks to them for the framework.
Now, to understand just how radical New Criticism was, we've got to rewind a bit and see what literary study was like before it showed up. And let me tell you, it was a very, very different world.
So before the New Critics, analyzing a text was kind of all over the place. You'd talk about the author's biography, what was happening in history at the time, how the book made you feel, or what moral lessons you could pull from it. But a rebellion was brewing, one that wanted to sweep all of that aside and focus on just one thing, the words on the page.
Yeah, the New Critics looked at these older methods and thought they were just messy, subjective, lacking any real rigor. And the language they used is so telling. They saw their movement as a corrective, a very deliberate attempt to make studying literature less about feelings and way more like a science.
So what was their big solution to all this messiness? Well, it was simple, it was elegant, and it was absolutely radical. They decided to put the text itself up on a pedestal, treating it like a perfect, self-contained object you could study.
And this gets us to their central idea, the autonomous text. The belief that a poem or a novel is its own little world. You don't need to be an expert on Shakespeare's personal life to get the genius of Hamlet. Nope, all you need is Hamlet itself, and you just need to read it very, very carefully. And this was kind of a democratizing idea, right? It meant you didn't need a history degree to be a great critic. All you needed was the text.
This is probably the best way to picture it. Imagine a great poem is like a perfectly sealed box. The New Critics said everything, and I mean everything, you need to understand it is already inside that box. The tension, the patterns, the meaning, it's all in there. Your job as a reader isn't to look for clues outside the box, but to figure out how the thing works from the inside out.
Okay, so if the text is this sealed object, how in the world do you get inside? Well, the New Critics came up with a very specific set of tools for the job. It was a whole new science of reading. The master tool, the absolute centerpiece of their toolkit, was something they called close reading. Now, this is not just reading casually on the couch. This is like a forensic examination of the text. You're zooming in on individual word choices, the syntax, the imagery, any paradox or irony, and you're figuring out how all those tiny little parts work together to create one complex, unified whole. It was their attempt to make literary analysis objective. And to make sure everyone stayed focused on the text alone, they came up with a pretty bold rule called the intentional fallacy. Basically, they argued that trying to guess what the author meant to say is a huge mistake, a fallacy. Why? Because an author's intention is private, it's unknowable, and at the end of the day, they said, it's totally irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the text they actually wrote and put out into the world for us to read. And this idea connects to another brilliant concept from the poet-critic T.S. Eliot. He came up with something called the objective correlative. He argued that the best way to show an emotion in art isn't to just talk about the emotion. Instead, you create a concrete formula for it in the text, a specific set of objects, a situation, a chain of events that automatically creates that feeling in the reader. It's really the ultimate example of show, don't tell.
But this super intense, almost clinical focus on the text as some kind of isolated object, well, it wasn't perfect. And in fact, this very approach ended up creating its own complicated and, you guessed it, paradoxical legacy.
And this is the question that later generations of critics couldn't stop asking. By treating a poem or a novel like it's this pure, aesthetic object, totally sealed off from the messy reality of history and culture and actual human lives, what do we lose in the process? What gets left out?
And the criticisms were pretty major. I mean, how can you really understand a poem like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland without knowing anything about the devastation and disillusionment after World War I? By ignoring context, New Criticism could reduce art to just a formal puzzle.
It also tended to prefer really complex, ironic poetry, which created this narrow idea of what good literature was, often leaving out works by women, people of color, and anyone else who wasn't playing by their specific rules. But for all its flaws, you can't deny its impact. It's huge. I mean, if you've ever been in an English class and a teacher told you to support your argument with evidence from the text, well, you've got the New Critics to thank for that. They made close reading a fundamental skill and made literary studies way more rigorous. In a lot of ways, they set the stage for all the theories that came later. They built the foundation that other critics would then challenge, react against, and build upon.
And that quote really just nails it. The legacy of new criticism is a total paradox. On the one hand, it gave us these incredibly powerful tools for looking deep inside a text, but it did that at the cost of cutting that text off from the very world that created it. It was a huge step forward and, at the same time, a dead end. Which leaves us with this big, final question to think about. Is it really possible, or is it even a good idea, to try and separate a work of art from the human being who made it and the world it was born into? That's the challenge that new criticism leaves behind for all of us.